Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Jim and Austin. I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about the Philippines today. Jim, President Duterte is facing some challenges with his neighbors, the Chinese. Is that right?
He's been facing challenges from the Chinese for about a decade now, ever since China decided that they own the South China Sea. It's a love-hate relationship because China has also become a major economic factor in the Philippines. But that's what China's been doing throughout the region. Becoming the largest investor, the largest exporter, and often the largest importer, even from a country like the Philippines. Normally, China only imports raw materials from most countries. Australia, for example, has become extremely, how should I put it, well off by selling, the abundant raw materials they have to China. But for countries like the Philippines, which have a less robust economy, China has become a threat not only because of the territorial claims on, ocean areas, but also because they offer, I guess what you might call potentially predatory loans. They call it debt diplomacy. And it's been happening a lot. The Chinese, the Chinese literally invade. They prefer to bring their own workers for major projects, and that's become something of an issue in many countries. In Africa, it was accepted because, China basically went along with the local customs and bribed the people running the place, and cleared the way to bring in their own workers, also pointing out that they were more efficient, there was no language barrier, et cetera, but they would also demand that their imported workers be allowed to stay. And before you knew it, the Chinese had, taken over large sections of the wholesale and retail economy, setting up, industrial operations. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing, and many countries realize, we have a even in the Philippines, we have a good news, bad news situation, whereas the Chinese were very helpful to the economy. But at the same time, this is galling. Why are the Chinese, we letting the Chinese do all this? And in the Philippines, it was recently an issue. It is recently an issue because China, when they bring in their own workers, even into an alien place like Pakistan, they basically set up a lot of retail operations, which are Chinese only. They will not serve anybody who's not Chinese. Now, in many countries, they just shrug their shoulders and say, okay, that's the way they roll. But in the Philippines, which has picked up a lot of, customs from the United States, that basically, raised the red flag, literally and figuratively. And that is becoming an issue. And this has, been a problem for the Philippines because it basically constrains their government, how the government can negotiate with the Chinese. This is good news and bad news because it means there's more scrutiny, even in a country which has been cursed by corruption, since forever in the Philippines. But there's even more scrutiny when it involves, China. So that is in a way good news because the Chinese do tend to be fast and loose, even if it isn't a local custom, as we've discovered in the United States and Canada. They will try and, buy their way into whatever deal they feel is best for their interests. So the Chinese are, like I say, good news, bad news for the Philippines. But currently the general attitude in the Philippines is the Chinese are not good for the Philippines. A lot of Filipinos can read Chinese, or at least enough of them. They can watch the Chinese, internet-based news, or get Chinese publications, and they point out that the Chinese popular opinion, which is controlled by the government. Certain opinions are simply not allowed. Another, custom they're trying to export. Um, they basically ignore, the government censors ignore any talk of, basically, oh, the Philippines is a Chinese territory. I mean, the entire country, a lost province. A lot of lost provinces in Asia these days, and that makes people in these lost provinces nervous, because China is increasingly following up on these wild claims. China is the Santa Claus and the demon from hell, depending on the day of the week in the Philippines, as it is throughout the region.
Austin?
Well, I want to refer our listeners to a column I wrote on Strategy Page. It's got the April 10th, 2019 on it, on point column called Manila's Beijing Bromance Wrecks on Pagasa Island. It picks up several points that Jim just made, including the debt trap. Now, the debt trap has become something of a political trap for Duterte, because his political opponents had been saying, watch out, look how much money we owe the Chinese, and they are unlikely to let us roll over the debt. They will make demands on something implicitly on our territory, because simultaneously with, as Jim said rather humorously, they're Santa Claus and the demon from hell. This Pagasa Island is their latest example of using cabbage strategy and swarm tactics to come into the Philippines exclusive economic zone, it's EEZ, and create an artificial island. They've done that, in other words, and then make the territorial claim that they're recovering. Jim, you call it a lost province. That's great. The Vietnamese feel the same way. They're not a province of China, but China thinks that it can just take whatever island that it wants off of the Vietnamese coast, and has so far gotten away with it. Vis-a-vis the Philippines. And that's there's the debt component is one that gives China a financial weapon. Again, if we're looking at this as cocktail warfare, the Chinese are exploiting their financial and economic weaponry, as well as their sea militia, as they call it, or naval militia, which consists of fishing boats as well as a coast guard, and they go into an area that China is about to where Chinese construction barges will soon appear and start pouring concrete. There's also another component to this. We've touched on this in the past. I touched on it, actually. We talked about it in detail once. China's preference for bilateral deals. In other words, where they can be the big bully and the weak neighbor, and that's certainly the situation economically and militarily with the Philippines. Would China make some sort of a deal in a debt trap, saying you sell us this uninhabited area? I don't know. It's certainly a scenario. I don't know that the Filipino people would. I think the Filipino people would certainly become quite territorial on that. Remember, the Philippines also won a arbitration hearing in The Hague, the tribunal that rules on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That I touch on that in the column as well. That was the Hague Arbitration Tribunal ruled that China had intruded on Filipino territory, also had illegally fished in Filipino waters, in other words, theft of a variety of maritime resources. And China just shrugged its shoulders because UN couldn't enforce it, Philippines couldn't. And the Obama administration didn't want to confront Beijing. So, all in all, Beijing certainly got what it wanted in terms of fishing Filipino reefs and in terms of encroaching on Filipino territory. Note, too, it's not just the Philippines. Jim's said, all these other lost provinces, but look how these artificial islands march consistently south through the South China Sea towards the Strait of Malacca. That's something else we've talked about. In other words, to get down towards Singapore. Duterte. Now Jim mentioned this. Duterte, when he came into office, that's why I use the term bromance in that column, made direct appeals to Beijing. Some of it was also posturing in playing to Filipino nationalists that resent American colonialism. At the same time, they admire the United States immensely. But I speculated in that column that what he was up to was attempting a rapprochement that would make a deal ultimately that would end Chinese territorial expansion. And here he said, we can get along, we can work together, we'll be, you can sell us things, we'll sell you things. But Beijing didn't buy it. They didn't buy it because they've had too much success. And he's caught, that didn't work. The debt trap, he's now agreeing with his political opponents that the debt trap is real. And one reason I wrote this column in April was because on April 4th, Duterte told China that the Philippines would react militarily if they continued their swarm tactics around this island, Pagasa Island, in the Spratlys. I mean, he actually threatened war. China, very carefully, the Chinese government just kind of shrugged and said, "Oh, this will settle down." We all know what Duterte's like. He's a bit of a loudmouth, shoots his mouth off, and he's brash. And that was the Beijing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry's response to his threat. There hasn't been any shooting, but this is the kind of situation where China has, in my estimation, China's really pushed this to the brink. I'm talking about the actual territorial seizure. We'll see. And the Philippines would be definitely a flashpoint, and not just a flashpoint with hot rhetoric, Dan. I'm not predicting a war. That's not what I'm saying. There is a war going on, and China's been winning it. It's a war with pouring concrete and ignoring international law and getting away with it. And the question is how far is that going to go before some brash, rash hothead like Duterte, and I'm not calling him a hothead, it's a bit unfair. He is someone who he's capable of hot-headed reaction, but this is one of the things where the Chinese had better consider the personality of the leader that they're confronting. That's a thought, anyway.
Now, Jim, the Philippines has some other problems that are continuing for them too. Down south, we published an article, I think a week ago, about some running gun battles that they're having with their Muslim insurgents.
Actually, they're winning that war. That's the Moro Rebellion. This is a problem that's been around since forever. The Spanish first encountered it when the Spanish first came in. What, 400 or 500 years ago. The first Europeans to basically come into the Philippines. They discovered that most of the Filipinos were pagans. Malay tribes, Malay peoples, much like in Indonesia, or Dutch Indies, as it was then called at the time the Spanish rolled in. But the tribes in the south, some of the southern tribes, were also Malay, but they were Muslim because Islam had slowly spread by missionary, not by force, into the Southeast Asia, and but at the time the Spanish showed up, it only really took hold in the far south. And of course, the Spanish offered Catholicism, which, make of that what you may, it was more attractive to Filipinos than Islam. There are some cultural differences between the peoples, as it were. They're all the same. Ethnically, there's not a lot of difference. But those people in the South, a small percentage of the population, overall population, who accepted Islam. Also, it's sort of like the Wild West. Culturally speaking, you go to any country, even in England, the North is considered rowdy. It is to a certain extent, but let's not get into that. In the United States, the South.
We're going to get letters from angry Scotchmen, Jim.
I know. Well, no, they're proud of it. But they basically do it right. But anyway, in Canada, you got the French and the English speakers, and then of course you have out west you get BC. But anyway, in the Philippines, the southern groups, not just the Muslims, because the southern Philippines is mostly Christian. Again, partially because Christianity is more attractive to most Filipinos. Got to remember, Islam literally means submission, and in a lot of countries it doesn't really appeal, and when a certain percentage of the population adopts it, they consider themselves distinct, and the relationship is often hostile. Anyway, that's been going on for years. The United States ran into it, in after the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. occupied the Philippines. They found out that the Moros were the most fierce, not always the most, clever, as it were, opponents, and that gave rise to iconic things like the .45 pistol. How do you stop a crazed fanatic Moro? From coming at you with a basically an edged weapon, a machete type weapon, and a .45 would do it where a 38 9mm caliber weapon would not. The Philippines inherited that problem, and the other problem, which is still involves running gun battles in the South, are communist rebels. They're still around. New ideas often, are accepted slowly in parts of the Philippines.
So traditional communists, though, that aren't so happy about capitalism like the communists they're dealing with out in the South China Sea, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. In other words, these are traditional communists who took a big hit in 1989, 1991, when all their communist models, as it were, in Europe, simply disappeared. That came as a shock. But the NPA, the Filipino communists, they still had some momentum because there were issues, the corruption, the crony capitalism, and sheer poverty in many parts of the Philippines had a certain appeal, and of course in the universities, things like this. They, for some reason, there's always a lot of popularity for how should I put it? radical solutions, police, state, government, that'll fix things, sure. But anyway, that's why they don't study history anymore. The NPA and the Moros, they've been on the decline, and this has nothing really to do with Duterte, although he speeded it up a little bit. But that had been going on, and even when Duterte came into office, 5 years ago, there was already a treaty sitting in front of Filipino Congress for an autonomous, Vegas Moro, Moro region, as it were, in the south. Small region, and the big debate when Duterte marched in was the areas, provinces, or parts of provinces where the Christians were a large. Well, they're always a minority down south. There's no area where the Muslims are the absolute majority. But the Moros wanted their autonomous area region to include a lot of Christians, and the Christians didn't like that. Not just the Christians down south, but Christians in general. And since they dominate, by large, like I say, over 95% of the population, 96% is Christian. And that was a real sticky point. But another sticky point was there were still how should I put it, militant organizations that were terrorist organizations. The MILF, that was the main one. There was another similar to the MILF that had made peace with the government in the 1990s, but then the MILF, the other large Muslim, separatist, as it were, whatever you want to call it, rebel group, did not agree to make peace. So it took another, 15, 20 years to get the MILF to come along. But then you still had, factions breaking off from MILF, saying no, it's all or nothing. And now you've got basically an Islamic State franchise in the Philippines, which is much diminished. Like I say, they're not even popular among fellow Muslims, and that counts for something. That counts for something even in the Philippines. But the remaining groups, like Abu Sayyaf, which is down in Sulu, the islands in the southwest. They basically have a few holdout groups, which are literally, gangsters pretending to be religious zealots. I mean, they do have some true believers, but mostly they're out for, kidnapping, extortion, whatever they can get away with. They have a sort of a Robin Hood strategy in the areas where they live, as it were. They spread the money around. And around 2000, they collected some very large, multi-million-dollar ransoms for Western, kidnapped hostages, and that doesn't happen much anymore. Very, very infrequently. They're mostly the most recent scam was going out to sea. I mean, they're right on the Sulu Sea. And grabbing passing boats, small boats, fishing boats, small coastal, freighters and what have you. Not taking the ships because there's no place where they can basically hide them safely while trying to ransom them. But they take the crews or certain select members of the crews, Indonesians, people from Bhutan, whoever, Thailand, whoever happens, they have the misfortune of going through there unaware of, there's pirates about. But they're on the decline. They are not the problem, and we report that because basically, yes, there are major gun battles, but the Abu Sayyaf and the Islamic State groups are losing. In fact, there was a couple of big ones, major ones, in the last year and a half, 2 years, and we keep track of the numbers. And there's just fewer and fewer of them there. There'll always be some, but as long as they get down to the level of just bandits, which have always been a problem in rural Philippines, that that is considered tolerable. You have a bigger problem in the South beyond religion, in that the Southerners are into these clan feuds, which often break out into little wars. This sounds almost medieval, I guess, in a way it is, where the central government, the crown, had tried for centuries to outlaw private wars. You've got to go to the king's courts, and that in places like the Philippines is still an issue. But a bigger issue, getting back to the basic theme of this discussion, is why is China a threat all of a sudden? This is something new. Until China industrialized, starting in the 1980s, and became a major import-export nation, which they had never been before. We're talking thousands of years of history. China had always accepted or embraced the idea that we have everything we need, which turned out to be a fairly smart, move. They were not dependent on anybody. They hustled. They had, for thousands of years, until the last, say, 400 or 500 years, they had the largest population of any unified empire on the planet, the largest GDP, although it's kind of hard to, calculate because, there was no such thing as international economies in those days. The Europeans invented that, by and large, while the Romans did. The Mediterranean countries first saw that, but there was nothing like that in China. The only reason they stayed out of places like Korea and Vietnam and on and off Tibet was because the locals didn't have much of value to the empire, nothing to offer. There was no there as far as the Chinese were concerned, economically or otherwise. And the locals were just too much trouble. They kept rebelling. The Vietnamese still have that dubious distinction, but they also are aware, and they're very wary of China, economic investing and what have you. They've become our allies again. I mean, this talking about, looking back over history, a lot of Americans like Roosevelt, and he had a lot of allies, saw the French in Vietnam as, colonialism in general was seen as a bad thing. I mean, we had promised the Philippines we were going to get out in 1944. That was delayed only 1 year. The official date was 45, before World War II, and that was delayed 1 year. MacArthur made a big deal about that, and the Filipinos appreciated that. But the Chinese, they have no deadlines, no independence, and that's why the Chinese so casually talk about, lost provinces. But the thing to consider is before the Industrial Revolution finally caught up with China, and we're talking something recent. It didn't really happen, until the 1970s and 1980s. Actually 80s and 90s, really. China basically accepted the traditional view that we are a continental power. And, you're going beyond our land borders. It's just not worth the trouble. But as they became an economic superpower in the modern sense, they said, hey, there's more lost provinces out there if we're willing to build a big navy. God, what possibilities. Now, in the United States, we're less aware of this, but, the closer you get to China, foreign countries like Vietnam, Korea, not North Korea. North Korea, well, yeah, they're aware of it, but they don't talk about it because, China's about their only ally, useful ally. But South Koreans are well aware of it. The Japanese are very well aware of it. Taiwan, the Taiwanese are now in charge. For a long time it was the Chinese, the losing factions, the Kuomintang, from the Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s. They dominated Taiwan politics, but in the last 30 years, they had democracy, and the native Taiwanese, who had never been part of China before, because again, it's an island. Hey, That we don't do islands. But the Japanese came in. Japanese were to many Taiwanese. This is what the Chinese will do to us. And then of course the Kuomintang came in and said, see what I say? We were right. You let these mainland Chinese in, and they're just another bunch of tyrants. So you have, and of course Tibet was an area which was free from the fall of in 2010 when the last Chinese Empire fell, until the early 1950s when China said, "Hey, you belong to us," and they just marched in, boom, and it's been downhill ever since. Not according to the Chinese, because the Chinese moved in a lot of Chinese, and their objective is to eventually make Tibet majority Han Chinese, which is what scares a lot of these countries. And now the list of potential victims is much larger. And that's why even the Philippines, that was unthinkable, before, the last decade or so. It was ludicrous. I mean, it was a punchline and a joke, talking about China, that the Philippines was a lost province. Now it's no joke. It's a real threat. And that's what really, grabs Filipinos, by the throat. Duterte, yes, he thought, well, look, maybe we can, make a deal. We won't let them buy this, but they can rent parts of us. That didn't go over too well. I mean, there were a lot of Filipinos who say, well, yeah, it's business. But the Chinese are not the mafia, and they play for keeps. They're about becoming your ruler, not your cutthroat banker and enforcer. And the Filipinos see a lot of evidence of that elsewhere in Asia. I mean, for example, what's going on in the Muslim areas of China, northwestern. The problem is that they're basically using as a baseline experiment for Big Brother, literally. George Orwell would say, oh yeah, it's real, and you got these computers and everything. The rest of Asia looks at that, and while some say, well, yeah, the security cameras are a good idea, but this idea of the government, basically scoring your behavior in general, and basically establishing your rights and freedoms according to how compliant you are with what the government wants. I don't think we want that so much. So China poses a threat on so many levels. And the scariest part of it, a lot of the areas being threatened were never threatened before. Never, ever. And throughout the region, you have countries, that were never quite, allies, are now allies. And the common enemy, the common threat is China. And that's been a profound change. But on the bright side, the Chinese don't want a war. They do the math. That's what makes them dangerous. They don't just go. They have their nationalism. The government tries to play that like a musical instrument, but that can backfire, as the Chinese are well aware. Historically speaking, the Chinese can basically get riled up, as it were, and out of control. But the Chinese government also realizes that if we maintain our control in China, and they've done a lot of things that nobody ever thought China would do, like basically mixing a police state with a relatively free economy. That was a scary proposition, because everybody in the West, we thought, hey, if you're going to become a free economy, democracy will follow. Well, not if you've got an effective enough police state standing in the way. It's the one thing, modern, communism has developed that has staying power. It's police state tactics that, work. Not forever, but if you basically, make it part of your portfolio, as it were, it can work for a long time. And the Chinese are basically proving that George Orwell was right. Big Brother is real, and he's speaking Chinese. So, there's the thing that basically haunts all of China's neighbors, not just the Philippines. But the Philippines are an interesting example because the Philippines are the one country in that part of the world that based a lot of its institutions on the United States. They have a Congress, they have a Senate, they're fanatics about democracy. The different parts of the country tolerate corruption, to a much a greater or lesser extent. Duterte, for example, takes a lot of heat in the West for his war on drugs. Now, what Duterte did first, he did it as a test when he was the mayor of a city down south, which had been out of control between drug gangs and Islamic terrorists and what have you. He just said, "All right, let's do like some of our neighbors, like Singapore or Indonesia, you name it, like they do. Let's go by local traditional rules. In other words, death penalty. Not a lot of the protections that we take for granted in the West." And surprise, surprise, it worked. It got a lot of people killed, but they run opinion surveys, and the opinion survey says, yeah, the good side, the bad side, on balance, we like it. The Western journalists had the hustle to get, a negative side to the story from the Filipinos. And it was kind of discouraging when they say, yeah, I know we have democracy, we have this, we have that, but damn it, we don't want our neighborhoods run by drug gangs. And we're not going to take it anymore. We're fed up. God, they should make a movie on that. But anyway, the thing is, different countries, different cultures have different attitudes towards these problems. And Duterte did to many people outside of the Philippines, the heretical thing of doing it using local, customs. And while the Philippines has adopted a lot of American, Western, traditions of law and democracy, they have not accepted them all. And this vive la différence, so to speak. I mean, these differences are important, and this is what you see playing out. But at the same time, the Philippines is confronting something that we are only coming, how should I put it, face to face with, and that is the threat of a global Chinese imperialism, not just a continental Chinese imperialism. And that is something, that is a threat, that is a change that goes far beyond, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world is starting to wake up to it.
Austin,
I just got a couple of quick things to say. I didn't mean to interrupt her. What's your question?
Well, I was going to say, why don't you give us your final thoughts on the Philippines, and we'll wrap it up.
Original edition of Quick and Dirty Guide to War, 1985, had a chapter called "The Philippines, the Sick Man of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations," and we were making Jim and I were alluding to Turkey being the sick man of Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century. All of the small guerrilla groups that Jim talked about, some of them weren't so small. The Moro Islamic Liberation Front is the MILF that Jim mentioned, and that's a radical organization. It's lost a lot of people. Abu Sayyaf was in some ways a split off from it, but Abu Sayyaf was influenced by Al Qaeda and Islamic State and elements of these Islamic Islamists is what it is. The Moro National Liberation Front, that was the other one, Jim, the MNLF that you were alluding to, had a bit of a mix. Maybe a third, 40% of it was Muslim, but it also had Christians in it, and they were seeking autonomy. They moderated a great deal. But a lot of this stuff was going on. There was a lot of shooting in the 1980s. The NPA, New People's Army, it's gone through 3 or 4 phases, but it was originally a very aggressive Maoist organization, similar to Sendero Luminoso. Different, but I'm talking about in the way that they would conduct some of their operations. They're a terrorist outfit, and finally I forget when it happened. The Philippines declared him terrorists. Now I think they're internationally declared to be terrorists. They fight on Luzon, Jim. They've got a up on the big island of Luzon. They still show up there. And if I recall correctly, reading about this, there was an army operation against them sometime in March, or a plan. So that kind of action is still ongoing, Dan, from the 80s. As Jim pointed out, though, a lot of it's died down, and the Manila, the national government's been darn good at it, particularly when there has been a political, and I'm including political Islamists as a political angle to it, and separatism. What Jim called about the clan fighting, and he said that sounds medieval or feudal. You might even say that it's tribal. That there are folks that would rile about that and say, "Well, wait a minute, we're not tribes. We have our own interests in our village and our area, but they do clash with their neighbors, and they haven't fully accepted, as Jim called it, the king's courts, the federal courts. Part of the reason on that, and it gets exploited by some of the extremists, is corruption within the country. They say we can't get an honest court. But to get back to the big picture, when Jim brought it down to that, we're dealing with an expansionary, imperialist China that has global aspirations. The Philippines are a glaring, maybe right now the most blatant example, because the Philippines are far more information porous, able to get in reporters, able to, and the Filipinos can get on the internet freely themselves. Then even Vietnam. Vietnam's made a lot of strides. And certainly, and that's Jim was talking about what's going on, and he said northwestern China, western China, Xinjiang province. I think that's the way you pronounce it. It used to be called Xinjiang when the old, and spelled differently. Now it begins with the X instead of a S. That was an ethnic Turkic region. That's where you get into Uyghurs. You see them crop up every once in a while in radical Islamic groups. It's been Hanicized, H-A-N, Han Chinese, world's largest ethnic group. And I think this sounds so extreme, but I think there's an accuracy to it. Really, there's a slow genocide against Turkic peoples, primarily the Uyghurs, going on in Xinjiang province. And Jim talked about how the Chinese want to move ethnic Han Chinese into an area and then populate it. That's what's going on in northwestern China, and it's largely off, below the radar, off the radar. Hard to get information about the area. There are some Uyghur autonomous groups. There are some Islamic groups that get information out. There are some Chinese that try to report on it. But the Philippines are aware of what's going on in Xinjiang province. I'll make one last point too. I said that mentioned that chapter we had in the 1985 edition. There's not a date on this, but it's April 2001, and you can go to the On Point 2001 archive index and see it. And the title of the column, and I'm looking at it right now on my computer, China's Boisterous Borders. And I wrote this right after the EP3 Ares incident, where the Chinese Air Force forced down an American electronic intelligence aircraft. And I've done this column actually a couple of other times. To some degree, I do it in the China chapter of Cocktails from Hell. But China, there are a lot of reasons for China's neighbors to be uneasy and fearful. And it's not new. You could see it evident in 2001. And I don't go into details on this, but I had not long before I wrote this, I actually had an opportunity to talk with a American military officer who had done some liaison work. I assumed that he had been in the embassy in Mongolia, and his comments were about how afraid the Mongols were of China, not Russia. Of China, and how the Mongolia wanted to have a relationship with the United States. Toggle forward to 2008, I'm at the Marine University at Quantico, participating in an instructive a war game simulation, and it was really about the Philippines for 2.5 days, and I was both part of the White Cell, but also commenting on some of the student moves and student decisions. And there was a Mongolian lieutenant colonel there taking the Marine Command and Staff College course. And I spoke to him about the conversation I'd had 8-9 years earlier, 10 years earlier, and he says, yes. He says the Chinese are expansionist, and we know it. And I'm picking out Mongolia because that's a place you don't hear about. You hear more about Tibet, still free Tibet bumper stickers. You hear a little bit about India because remember the 1962 Sino-India War? It's not over. Now the thing is what's really hot. It sounds is the Philippines. There really is a conflict. Slow but successful war waged by Beijing, and it's a territorial acquisition war. And I read Jim's latest report at the end of April on the Philippines. Duterte had gone to Beijing, and they talked about, when I said that he had threatened military action on this, and they're trying to, paste over it rhetorically. I also recall when in this strategy talk, I said that the Chinese foreign ministry said, he's just being, shooting his mouth off, being rash. The fundamental situation is as dire as Jim Dunnigan said earlier. And look, again, you're pushing cocktails from hell, that chapter 3 on China, the dragon revives. It's documented, and the Philippines is a case study in how China is expanding right now in Southeast Asia, but also has the same kind of operations going on worldwide. I'll leave it at that. How about that, Dan?
That sounds great. Well, we'll continue to watch it as we always do. Thanks for being here, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Till then.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.